And those two-person companies may deal with billions or trillions of records over the course of a few weeks. So they also need the same kind of database. And what's changed, and the reason that this database we're working with is so interesting, is it's open source. So that whole cost equation, having to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars up front, that goes away.
Welcome to the My Future Business Show, where we get you in front of your best audience and keep you there. Not only are we interviewing the biggest names in business to help you become even more successful, we're inviting you to book your spot on the show to help you grow your business. So at the end of the call, make sure you fill in the interview application form at myfuturebusiness.com/interviews. Hi and welcome back to the My Future Business Show. My name's Rick Nuske, and I'm telling you what, today I have somebody very special lined up for you today. His name's Robert Hodges. Welcome to the show, Robert.
Hi, Rick. I'm glad to be on.
Yes, look, we were just talking a little bit prior to the call about a few different things. You're in the tech space, and we're going to dive into that in a moment. But normally what we do, Robert, is give you the opportunity to just share a little bit about your background with the My Future Business audience.
Sure. I've been a computer hacker since I was a kid, which actually pushes it back to the early 70s. I learned in science class there was a computer in the back of the room and a manual, and you could just sign up and learn how to program. And so I did that along with a couple of my friends, and that's how I've been involved in computers in one way or another ever since. Now, since the early 80s, I've been working with databases. So actually most of my professional career has involved either applications that use data or the databases themselves. And in that time, I've been in or run 6 startups. I'm currently on number 6. So it's all been focused on programming, all been focused on data, and it's been a really interesting adventure.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. I've always been into technology. It's one of the things I love speaking about because, in today's society, in the business space, questions like if you're not online, where are you? And if you're technology inept, how good are you likely to be? Now, did you say that you were in San Francisco? Is that where you were based?
I actually live in Berkeley.
Berkeley.
So I'm just across from San Francisco, but pretty tapped into the whole California Bay Area.
Yeah, wow. And they have a deep-seated relationship with Silicon Valley, don't they?
Absolutely. And what's interesting in the database field is some of the really core technology was actually developed at the University of California at Berkeley and continues, that tradition actually continues at the university today. So the technology that we're working on, the analytic technology, is informed in part by work that came out of Cal.
Right. Yeah, and if we can, I'd like to talk a little bit about this in a moment. Is its original genesis was back in Russia. Your current commercializing business, is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So, and the way that this got started actually was there's sort of 2 ways to looking at it: how I got involved and how the technology developed. So, as far as the technology, it was developed originally by a company called Yandex, which is sometimes described as the Russian Google. They do search, they do web services. They're a very popular website and really, really great technology company. And around 2011, they were dealing with a problem of trying to understand how people were using their services. So, for example, somebody would come to the site. What were the sequence of steps that they would go through to buy something? And that's sometimes called funnel analysis. They needed a database to help them figure that problem out. They couldn't find one that met their requirements, so they ended up writing their own. And that database was called ClickHouse, and comes from clicks, as in the clicks you're clicking around in the browser. And they ended up open sourcing it in 2016. And it was at that point that it began to be used by people outside of Yandex. So that's where the technology comes from.
And for the most part, that this the writing of the code would be universal, wouldn't it?
Yes, in the sense that this is code that could be used by anyone. That's correct. Now, it happens that there's a particular set of problems that it's very well suited to help with, and those are when people are dealing with very, very large numbers of records typically coming from a single type of source. So for example, like reading temperature readings off devices or reading the logs from web servers, which are similar information and end up generating billions or even trillions of records. And then you have to try and figure out, hey, um, what's going on in there? What's the sequence, for a given person, what's the sequence of things that they did within a particular hour?
Mm-hmm.
For people who are, like, where do people come from when they visit the site? All kinds of statistics like that you can then extract out of these very large and very monotonous data sets.
Yeah, it seems to me like it's very good at doing that one thing, but it does a multitude of things within that one silo, doesn't it?
Correct, and it turns out an amazing number of people have this problem. So where we got involved, and just to give an illustration, is that I actually started working with folks in Russia in about 3 companies ago, and I made friends with a guy named Alexander Zaitsev, who lives in Moscow, and he was running the analytics for an ad business actually in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he discovered this database, and what they needed was something that would enable them to crunch data so that they could build models to serve ads very efficiently. They were using another database called Vertica for a variety of reasons that wasn't working, so he switched over to this new database, ClickHouse, and they reduced their costs. They were able to run quite a bit faster than they were with Vertica, and he was so happy with it, he thought, hey, we should have a company. And so this ad service problem, you have all this, I think as some of your listeners may be aware, ads are served based on behavioral information where you kind of figure out, hey, their cookies, people's locations get tracked, all that spooky stuff that it tends to show up in the hall that people discuss in the halls of Congress. But that all feeds into a decision about which ad should you see right now. And so that's one use, but then there's a whole wide range of problems that also have the same characteristics. We have a customer of our company right now that builds fraud detection systems, and what they use this database for is they come into a credit card, for example, a credit card servicing company, and they will just throw in all the data that this company has, and then they'll use this database to sort of work through the data, figure out what's there, what kind of things should they be looking for when they finally build the fraud detection system. So it's an enormous range of problems that have this characteristic.
Yeah, and I think about a couple of things. If we can explore some tangents off of this idea of clicks and marketing and so forth, and some of the things that you face. You have these nowadays. You have, what are they called? The ad blockers, and then you have the recent information sharing scandal with Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. What are some of the things you're facing in that regard? Do any of the clients that use this type of technology, are they facing those things directly?
Absolutely, and actually one of the interesting things is that if you read the newspapers, you get the impression that it's just like a total mess out there, that nobody cares about security. But it turns out that most companies that we deal with are actually very responsible with the way that they deal with data. So one of the biggest obstacles that we have is actually putting in features into the database that will enable those companies to set up systems that actually protect the data adequately. So for example, like a really simple example is making the database plug into a centralized system for logins so that the company can control who can actually get into the database and look at stuff. So these are features that this is actually a big, as we build our business, actually, this is a big part of the business, is adding that stuff in so that we can allow more businesses to use it.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing this wonderful journey that you're on at the moment. I'd love to talk about some of the challenges that you might face yourself as the CEO of Altinity. Is that the name of the business?
Altinity, yes. That's we're incorporated in the UK, been around for 2.5 years at this point.
Fantastic. And as a CEO, this is part of the whole focus for the My Future Business audience, is to help up-and-coming entrepreneurs and existing small to medium-sized organizations understand some of the the daily challenges. What's something that you can share with the My Future Business audience?
I think To be frank, the biggest challenge when I've only been running the company for a little over 6 months now. I
Mm-hmm.
was actually, just to go back and, how I jumped on board,
Yep.
I knew Alexander. Um, we've been friends for years. We see each other every time he comes to the U.S. And he finally persuaded me, hey, this is a great opportunity. We should come. We should finally work together to, do something together. So I joined on January 1st of this year. And the first real problem that I had to deal with is the fact that we're a startup and nobody knows who we are.
Ah.
So, for example, we have a Twitter account. It has something like 43 followers. So when we have something exciting to say, we can't just post it on Twitter. That's not going to do any good. Nobody will ever see it. So
Mm-hmm.
the first real challenge that we had to deal with was just being able to figure out how to get our message out. And we've done it in a couple of layers that, trying to, for us, the first thing is to sort of go to the places where the tech people are that have this problem, do presentations, show them that we know what we're talking about. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, we go to computer conferences, we do webinars, and we're basically trying to lock in people who are maybe already using this database and might need help. The second sort of, and you can think of that as sort of the core of the marketing,
Yeah.
and then there's a wider kind of marketing that actually has been, I think, harder for us, but at the same time more interesting, and that's to really have a social media presence so that we can reach people who might not even be thinking about the database necessarily, but would actually find this message useful and, at some point may come to us because they need help, and then we can do business. So that's, I think, been the single biggest challenge as we've been building the company.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Now, is Altinity aimed at large corporations? Who is your audience?
It's pretty much anybody that has this problem. And one of the, traditionally, this kind of database, which typically is called a data warehouse,
Mm-hmm.
used to be sold to large companies, and they required specialized hardware. They were extremely expensive. They took a long time to set up. So what you would find is that you would go and you would sell this software to somebody like Walmart or Bank of America or Citadel Securities. Well, what's happened is that the market and the challenges of data have changed over the last 15 to 20 years. And so now what we find is, yes, you've got people like Walmart and Citadel Securities out there that have these problems with very large quantities of data. So that's an important part of the market. But you've also got two-person companies that are, for example, helping people analyze log information from the services that they're running in their data centers or in the cloud. And those two-person companies may deal with billions or trillions of records over the course of a few weeks.
Yes.
They need something, so they also need the same kind of database. And what's changed, and the reason that this database we're working with is so interesting, is it's open source. So that whole cost equation, having to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars up front, that goes away. The second thing is it will run anywhere. So I run it on a laptop, but there's companies like large companies in the internet space like Cloudflare that run it on hundreds of nodes. So we basically have this software that meets the needs of both large and small, but also has is also very accessible to all of these types of companies. So the market, in a nutshell, is big.
Yes.
It's sort of like little people who we hope will grow big, but it's also the big folks as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful insight. Thank you so much. There's this growing pulse, Robert, in relation to machine learning and AI. I was wondering if you could just share your impressions of those types of technologies with us.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you bring that up. I think it's one of the biggest changes in data management that I've seen over my career, and I go back pretty far. The first database I started working with was something called M204.
Mm-hmm.
It was a database used by the U.S. government, and I started working with that in 1983. ClickHouse is database number 20. And we've gone from, as I say, these very expensive, specialized, difficult to manage databases to databases that are just ubiquitous and sort of very, sort of deal with enormous quantities of data. There are different kinds of databases. So the so there have been a number of transitions during that time, but I think the introduction of machine learning and what's sometimes called deep learning using neural networks is one of the most profound changes I've seen. And I think that the reason that I would say that is that this allows us to solve problems that are just, it's not just that they're hard to solve, it's hard to even think about clearly. And I'll give you an example. I was at a talk recently where some folks were talking about trying to evaluate mining equipment to figure out when it needed maintenance. And so what they do is a lot of the mining equipment, if you've seen pictures of these trucks that go around in these mines, they're very, very large.
Yes.
And it turns out that they collect enormous amounts of data inside the trucks, which you can then dump out into, into a database and analyze. And so what they were doing was analyzing all the sensor data and then using it to figure out, hey, when is it time for these trucks to have different maintenance procedures? And this is something that you can do with machine learning. Another example is just being able to identify pictures. A great example, there's a company called Carfax that you can sort of sign up for when you want to sell a car, and they do a lot of image recognition as well. So there's just some very, and one of I went to a talk on that particular subject given by another vendor actually that was in the same space, and they were able to take your picture that you upload of your car. They'd be able to tell whether it's a one-door, two-door, whether it's left to right, back to front.
Yep.
Basically, all this information, convertible versus station wagon versus sedan. It was astonishing. They were able to identify all of this stuff out of images, and this is a sea change to be able to do this in the data that we're processing.
Yeah, I also just recall how deep learning, machine learning, AI, call it what you will, was also playing a big part in creating what I don't recall where the source was, but they were talking about how it can create the ideal face over the collection of multitudes of different faces, the width between the eyes and, the length of the face and the size of the jawline. It's just some amazing technology out there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the facial recognition thing is I think one of the things that grabs people's attention, most clearly. And one of the really interesting things is that you can actually now deploy computer programs which can automatically recognize people's faces. It's kind of scary, but at the same time, it's kind of miraculous how well this stuff works. It works in many cases better than humans.
There's always this argument for the dark side of all these wonderful technologies. What's your thought on that? Do you think that this could potentially go bad? Because there's a lot of fear out there from what we don't know.
I think the bad stuff, or a lot of the bad stuff, has already happened. To be totally honest, there's basically, and people in Silicon Valley have been pointing this out for a long time, that there's been this loss of privacy because there is so much data that we inadvertently expose about ourselves. So, for example, when you're using a browser, just by somebody tracking the pattern of clicks and the way that you click about the screen, it is possible to basically identify the person. It almost amounts to a signature to you. And this is a level of what's, I think, difficult about this is you're exposing information in a way that it's just really difficult to prevent it from happening. So that the cat is out of the bag on this one. And I think the big challenge here is not so much the technology itself, because the technology can be used, the same technology that, for example, could be used to, sort of identify people's faces and track their locations by governments, can also be used to read X-rays and identify things like lung cancer. So the technology in some sense is neutral. I think what's not neutral is how we choose to deploy it and what kind of laws that we pass to, to prevent the bad effects of the technology. And I think it's only, I think the problem, that one of the problems that we've had is, I think in Silicon Valley, we have been somewhat naive about the bad effects of some of this technology. So we actually haven't been thinking ahead about how to build systems that maybe can avoid this problem. So I think it's a challenge that it's a challenge for the technical people to provide advice, but also for our governments to figure out how to use this, how to set up rules so that we use this in everybody's best interest.
Absolutely, and that's some wonderful insight. Some other things to think about on the other side of the coin, that it's the actual user that should be aware that as soon as you click on to go online, that the responsibility in part does come back to you.
It does, but I think that one of the things that you do learn as you start to look at this data is there's so much of it being collected, and it's at such a detailed level that there's almost nothing you can do to prevent having vital information about you being exposed. So, for example, if you have your phone just turned on, your location is being tracked. Yep. Somebody is tracking it, and in fact, as it turns out, I think as we all sort of discover over time, it turns out a lot of people are tracking it. Because we have apps which are convenient. We can find our friends, but we're also at the same time revealing our locations. Just to use that example. So I think it's not really possible for people to protect themselves at at some level. It's very difficult for individuals to do much about this, and that's why I think the challenge here is to have sort of global solutions where we set the ground rules and everybody has to follow them.
Yeah, it's the intersection between privacy and technology, isn't it? How are we going to get them
right?
To work
yeah,
together?
and I'm personally optimistic that will happen. I don't think I would last too long, and most tech people tend to be optimists. We always think we can do stuff, even though if it turns out, it usually turns out to be a lot harder than we thought. But if we really knew how hard it was, we probably wouldn't start. So I'm an optimist, and I also have a lot of faith that we've been around for a really long time. We've dealt with a lot of problems. We tend to work things out. It's just it takes us a little while sometimes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today, Robert. It's wonderful. I wonder, is there any coincidence that when somebody has a conversation, I hear this quite often nowadays, that all of a sudden they're seeing, they're in their own homes, they're having a conversation, they're not actually surfing the net per se, but their smart devices there, and all of a sudden on Facebook they get we're talking about dog food, for example, and then all of a sudden they get a list of dog food ads come up on their phone. Is this part of AI, the learning and listening process? Is this happening as well?
I don't know for a fact that it is, because sometimes things just happen by chance. But it's fair to say that it isn't. That is something that you can do with the technology. So, for example, there's a lot of technology that goes around identifying who a person is based on things other than sort of obvious things like their national ID number or their name or their address or something like that. There are things that are based on what they're doing, and so it is possible to do that. So it could be.
Yeah.
I've never worked on those systems directly, so I don't know for a fact, but it's definitely within the realm of possibility.
So if we come back to your current organization, ClickHouse and Altinity, you and I were talking a little earlier prior to the call about international trade in 2019, and I'd love to explore a little bit about your perspective on growing a business in 2019.
That's a great question. So first of all, we're international in a couple of fundamental ways. So in the most basic way, we're international in the way the software is developed. So the original authors of this software were from Yandex, and many of them still work there. We also participate, but we participate through open source development. So the code is actually, for this software, is actually hosted on GitHub, which is now owned by Microsoft.
Yep. Anybody
can go to the code, anybody can look at it, they can pull a copy, they can build their own versions of the servers. But what's even more important is that anybody from anywhere in the world can actually say, hey, I see something that that this, I see a new feature, or I see a bug. Here's a fix for that problem, or to add that new feature, please add it to the software. And the open source software, together with technologies like GitHub, allow people to do that in a distributed fashion. And so this has been a fundamental change in the way software is developed that's evolved over the last 20 years or so. So for our company, what it means is that we're actually highly distributed. There's currently 12 of us in the company. We're growing fast, but we're basically between Berkeley and Moscow. And we're able to function quite effectively because of this open source technology and the fact that everybody can participate from these remote locations. Now, there is another, so that's fairly common, and there's a number of companies who do that nowadays, and particularly in the data management space. It's a very, very common model. So we're kind of used to doing that. We do things through email, we use Zoom, we use Slack, and all these other communication tools, and then we share the code. What's probably more interesting in our case is the fact that we are marketing software that was originally written in Russia. And we get some kind of interesting responses to that, particularly when we come to the United States and people say, hey, what's this software what's this software that's written by Russians? Why should I, is this going to do something to my data or something like that? And so one of the first humps we have to get over is just sort of opening people's minds to the fact that, hey, there's actually some pretty good technology that comes from outside the United States.
Yeah.
And so when those conversations start, I do, a couple of things. One, as I mentioned, other Russian-based software. There's a very well-known web server called Nginx that was written in Russia. So my first question is, well, do you run Nginx? And it turns out about 96% or so of U.S. companies are running it. So that gets them over the hump a little bit. If they're still unsure, I say, well, you've heard of Soyuz, right? Those are the folks that give our astronauts rides up into space. That's a Russian program as well. So we sort of give people, have to open people's minds to the fact that there's good software that's developed in other places, and it's safe to use, and it's also very effective for the job at hand.
Yeah, and that's half the battle, isn't it? Giving them the new perspective.
Yeah, and I think that I think one of the interesting things going forward is there's a full-blown trade war going on between the United States and China. It's beginning to, if you look at the macroeconomic level, it's beginning to affect things like foreign direct investment from China into the United States. We see the investment levels going down. We see people we see supply chains on the U.S. side beginning to move out of China and into other countries. So it's definitely beginning to have an impact. I think one of the interesting questions going forward is to come back and say, is this going to have an impact on this open source development model that's actually essential to our business? Because in the end, we work because we have free communications through the internet between countries. That's the whole model of how we develop software and how we interact with each other. If the internet itself were somehow to be broken, like, for example, broken up into pieces that don't really communicate with each other anymore, that would actually be a very fundamental problem. And so that's something that, I think a lot of us are watching carefully for signs of, do we see that happening or not? So far, I have not seen it. There are cases, like the way China manages the internet, but they don't seem to get in the way of developing software, at least at the current time.
Yeah, there seems to be a few firewalls up. We would hope that there were not going to be any more.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that, and it won't, people, tend to, in the U.S., tend to, be fixated on things like the Great Firewall of China. But I think that there are other reasons why the internet might break up into pieces in ways that could impede our communication. And I think a simple one is if you look at what happened with the terrorist attack in New Zealand a few months ago. This was something where there's real concerns about what people, for example, are doing on social media and whether that should be allowed by the laws of different countries. These are all things where as people work through these issues, they may decide, hey, we might be better off just being detached from the internet. It remains to be seen.
It does remain to be seen. Now, if people want to find ClickHouse, they want to learn more about you and Altinity, where will they find you?
Our URL is www.altinity.com, and we have a blog, so that you can easily get that. We're also on Twitter. We're also on LinkedIn. So that's how you can find out about the company. As far as the ClickHouse technology itself, if you just type ClickHouse database in Google or your favorite search engine, you'll immediately get lots of results that show you that link you to documentation as well as code for the database.
Well, thank you.
So it's pretty, and for anybody who's a developer, you can basically get this database set up and running in a few minutes. You actually don't need any help from us. You don't need any help from the original developers. It's very easy to set up.
Simplicity is the key to success, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, and that's really what we're trying to do, is offer sort of this software. In fact, one of the reasons that we're so bullish on this company and on the software that we're selling is it's so simple to use. Where our business comes in is, once people go beyond the laptop and are now dealing with trillions of records and they want to get answers back in a fraction of a second, then there's more, there's more skill and more technique required to do that, and we offer software, we offer services to help people do that easily.
Well, there you go, everybody who's on the call with us today. This has been just some fantastic insights in just a few of the challenges, the opportunities, and even the simplicity behind this wonderful technology. And as is the case with all calls, I will be making the URL links back to Robert, Altinity, and ClickHouse. Robert, thank you so very much for spending some time with me on the My Future Business show today.
Thank you, Rick. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the call, then make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, share us with your friends, and book your spot on the show at myfuturebusiness.com/interviews. And if you're looking for solutions that will help grow your business, then visit myfuturebusiness.com/shop.